Okay, so I'm Sarah Verdon, I'm 27 and I am a PhD student, originally a speech pathologist, undergraduate, but now doing my PhD, more broadly looking at cultural and linguistic diversity in children, in Australian children, but also looking in a global context. I am from a very regional part of Australia, in a population of 700 was the town that I grew up in, and it was very monocultural, white, English speaking, and so I'm monolingual. I've dabbled in other languages like French and Spanish, but not very competently. Yeah, so my experiences have been quite different, given that I've come from quite a monocultural area, but when I graduated I moved to the city and started specialising in autism in Melbourne, and was faced with a very culturally diverse caseload. Many of the children didn't have English as their first language, and I guess that was my first sort of immersion into trying to work with families that weren't from the mainstream culture of being white and English speaking in Australia. And after that I decided to go and volunteer in Vietnam for a while, and that again was another experience of being immersed in a cultural setting that wasn't familiar to me. And again I came up against a lot of different cultural and linguistic barriers. And then I moved to London and started working in East London. And that was a very high migrant population, so most people didn't have English as their first language in the clinic where I was working. And after the culmination of these three experiences, I really started to reflect on my own practice and what I had been taught, and the way that I thought about practice from my own lens, given all these different cultural experiences that I'd had. And I started to sort of become quite critical of the way that we enact practice with kids, and the way that we use standardised testing and standardised approach, looking for this one gold standard of best practice, which doesn't necessarily universally apply to every individual child and family. And so the opportunity came up for me to do my PhD back in Australia, so I moved back home, and I'm now in my third year of investigating different practices with kids from all over the world, and just looking at different ways that different practitioners engage with families, use different kinds of resources other than standardised testing, and just a diverse range of practices to try and support individual children for individual needs. Yeah, so I guess they're almost unwritten dialects that exist within different cultures and different places. So although obviously I speak standard Australian English to you right now, just even going back home to my regional setting, it's a very different way of speaking. Syntactic structure is different, the vocabulary is different, the way that people engage socially is different, and although I guess it's not formally recognised as a different dialect, from my study I would certainly say that yes, it is a different dialect, and I'm sure that these regional variations occur all over Australia and all over the world, but maybe are not recognised and sometimes seen as disadvantaged or broken English. Yeah, so we have a really rich culture and history of linguistic diversity among our Aboriginal population. So we have the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, who are the original custodians of our land, which was settled by the British in 1770. But prior to that there were over 250 different nations or tribes or language groups. And so it was quite diverse. It was almost, if you think about it in a way of Europe, that there are so many different countries on the one landmass, and unfortunately they often get grouped together as just Aboriginal people, but there was such huge diversity, and as I said, over 200 language groups, and it's estimated up to 600 different dialects prior to the English settlement here in Australia. Currently we have 110 still living, but only 13 are considered safe and strong, which means that they're spoken across all generations. So that's been a real area of interest in my research, is looking at different practices and initiatives that are currently being undertaken in Australia to preserve our Indigenous Australian languages, because basically for the approximately 100 languages that are still surviving but aren't considered strong, they may only be being spoken by the oldest generation of their communities, and these people may be 60-year-old plus. So essentially we have a less than 20-year window to get this linguistic knowledge of these people before it's at risk of dying out, and give their children and grandchildren the opportunity to learn their cultural language, which of course is so important for their cultural identity as well as their linguistic diversity. So that's something that I'm really interested in. Probably the biggest challenge for us as speech-language pathologists is trying to differentially diagnose between a disorder or a difference. But also from my perspective, I have to think, what are you trying to help this child with? Even if the child isn't disordered and they speak great African American English, is your goal that they can speak general American English? If that's your goal, and that's the parent's goal and that's the child goal, then that's a perfectly fine goal to work on. But if your goal is to try and stamp out their use of African American English and force them into a language shift towards general American English, or mainstream American English, it may be called, then yes, that's an issue of cultural discrimination. And I think it's really important. Here in Australia, we have acknowledged Aboriginal Australian English as its own dialect with its own structures and rules, and it's not broken English, and it's not a disorder if children speak that English. It is a legitimate dialect that's spoken. It's an interesting dialect because, as I said, it's stemming from 250 language groups, but there are general characteristics that are spoken by Aboriginal Australian English. So, for example, it may be an F for TH substitution. It may be to do with different syntactic structures, different use of pronouns. So certain characteristics like that may appear to be disordered or poor grammar by someone who is trying to encourage standard Australian English, needs to be recognised as its own dialect that is correct in its own right. So getting back to your question, the responsibility of speech-language pathologists, I think, is to equip ourselves with knowledge. There is no excuse to be ignorant. There is a thing called Google, so you should find it. And education doesn't stop at the end of your degree. We have a responsibility to our clients. If you have a child coming in that speaks Russian and you know nothing about Russian, there are many websites where you can learn about Russian language, phonological features of Russian, pragmatic features of Russian, even how to say hello to Russian, to try and be inclusive to parents when they come into your clinic. It's important for us to put ourselves in an uncomfortable space because we're expecting our clients to put themselves in an uncomfortable space. I think my general perspective is that every child has its own unique culture. Even children within their families can have a different culture from their siblings, and each child should be valued in their own right and viewed as an individual. There are no blanket rules, but we can do our best to take thorough case histories, engage in conversations with parents, teachers and the children themselves to find out what this child wants from their life, what great strengths they already have and what we can do to help them.
Thank you, Sarah.